we're going through the presentation, or Anne's going through her presentation, feel free to add any questions in the meeting chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session as well, so you can unmute yourself at that point, and you can also just ask your question. You prefer to do it that way versus typing it in the chat. And then finally, at the end of today's meeting, I know through the email I had sent, anybody who attends today's meeting gets a coupon for a free cookie at the Arc Deli. So at the end, from the email that I had sent out yesterday, just for your registration, if you could please email me back with your names and addresses. The coupons that we send out have to go through the mail just because they're numbered. So if you want that free cookie from the Arc Deli, feel free to send me your name and your address, and I can send that out to you. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Anne. And like I said, any questions that you have, feel free to type in, or we'll answer at the end. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for coordinating this. It's really nice to get my information about family reimbursement out to everybody. I know I'm working on that constantly every single day. So to have a large group get together and be able to do that is amazing. So I'm just going to jump right into my PowerPoint. And just let me know if you can't see it.
Yeah, we can't see yet.
Oh, not yet. Hold on one second. So I put this together just to highlight the really important pieces of family reimbursement.
Oop, it popped up and it disappeared.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yep, there we go.
Perfect. So the purpose of the program is to enhance the family's ability to provide in-home care for a member with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So it's just really about providing extra support to the family while the individuals are in their care in their home. So different ways that we do this, the most frequent requests that we get are really for items such as supplements, insure or boost, to give the individual extra nutritional support. We get a lot of requests for pull-ups when the Medicaid allotment is either exceeded or it doesn't meet the individual's needs. Wipes go along with that request usually. And then we do some kind of outside of the ordinary things, such as for one family, we were able to reimburse them for an adaptable sled because the individual had difficulty walking and they wanted to be able to take them out with the family. And we also are reimbursing for things like therapies. So, you know, when you have an individual that has all these extra needs, it obviously causes a lot of financial strain on the family. And that's what our program is really here for, to alleviate a lot of those expenses. So, sorry, I'm not sure why this isn't just going.
It's not moving along on your end.
Right, yeah. That's okay. I don't know why it's not.
Try something.
Let's see. It keeps saying resume and then it's kind of just not. But you can see it.
Well, I could just see the screen. It says Administrative Directive Memorandum, and it says effective July 1st, 2022.
Oh, I got you. Okay, here, let me do this. Sorry. I have to end that show and start another one. That's why. Sorry.
Okay. No problem.
Let's do this again. Now we're on, right?
Yep,
Perfect.
good to go.
All right. So this is what I was just talking about, the purpose of our program. So eligibility. So eligibility for the program is pretty simple. You just have to have that established eligibility with OPWDD. And the document that we require is your notice of decision. That's the preferred document. And then obviously, like I was just saying, this is a program to help out families, so the individual would have to reside with the family member. And there's a couple different things that go along with that. So for individuals that are self-directed, they have to have family support services in the budget. And if it's not in the budget, they would have to add that. They would have to file an amendment and add that before they would be able to submit an application. So you kind of have your basic eligibility, and then you have eligibility requirements if you have self-direction, or eligibility requirements depending on the category that you're applying for. And you just have to make sure that all those eligibility requirements are met when you submit your application. Otherwise, it would obviously not be processed or get returned. And for some requests, we do require clinical justification, which would be from a licensed medical provider. An example of that would be sometimes we cover technology items like tablets or laptops and those within those categories, they all have their own very specific guidelines. And we just have to make sure that this is not the responsibility of anyone else, such as like the school district and things, or Medicaid, or those other programs or services that the individual might get. So for instance, with a technology request, it can't be used for school, because that would obviously be the responsibility of the school. And then if you wanted to, if it was for the purpose of communication, there are very specific guidelines that also go with that request. And then such as a communication assessment. But there are examples of instances where families apply and they don't have those other resources or reasons, which would be such as encouraging interaction. And just describing that in your application and how that person has a deficit and how the item would assess them. And that would be how you complete that portion to meet the eligibility requirements. So just following along with those things, and we have a whole list of categories, and within those categories, they all have their own eligibility requirements that need to be met. So application requirements, with each request, we require an application, and we'll take a look at the application in a couple minutes. Most important thing with the application is you have to have original signatures. It's no copies. And unfortunately, it's not available online or to submit online. So you would either be mailing that or dropping it off to our 2060 building, which I encourage sometimes for families, especially if they're close to the deadline and they want to get that application in. OPWDD just doesn't want the option of people filling them out online right now. And then, as we just talked about, the eligibility document that goes with that. Original receipts. So we can't accept copies of receipts. They would have to be originals. But when you're purchasing something online, say from maybe like an Amazon or some other site, we can accept that electronic receipt because that would be considered an original receipt. When you do submit those online receipts, it's just important to make sure that you have that process, that credit card processing, just to show the payment transaction. everything just has to be really clear and clarified as to how it was purchased, where it was sent, those type of things. And if it's not, then we would have to put that application on hold. So we really just don't want to have to do that. So just including all the information with that transaction would be really helpful with processing an application. The justification of need is one of the most important pieces of the application. And the application is not complete if this box is empty. So OPWDD is really, with their new ADM coming out, they're really going to be focusing on that justification of need box. And what needs to be in there are the specific details of the disability and how that relates to the need and the request of the item. So really going into a lot of explanation is going to be required. Sometimes you need clinical documentation for some requests, such as medical or clinical services, dietary requests, adaptive equipment, technology, sensory items. And that clinical documentation would come from a licensed medical professional. And we also have a form, a real easy form that you can either submit to them or they can write up their own note, either or. It just has to contain the necessary information I just talked about, the specific details of the disability, the exact item, and how it relates and how it would benefit the individual. And then if you're self-directed, you would just need your self-direction documentation. When you are submitting an application and you have all of those things, it makes that process much faster so that we don't have to send the application back. We don't have to follow up with a care coordinator or a fiscal intermediary or anyone else, so that we can just meet your request as fast as possible. So the other thing that we're looking at when we're processing applications is if you use any of the following services. So if you're using, a lot of these individuals obviously have Medicaid. If you are using any of these CDPAP, home care-based services, waiver programs, self-direction, we would require documentation of what services you're getting, how much you're getting, and why you need additional support. So for instance, if you're getting Medicaid and you want to process an application for pull-ups or wipes, we would need a denial or explanation of benefits from the insurance. We would also need, just saying like, this is what we get for Medicaid, this is what we get for pull-ups. And then just saying this either doesn't meet the individual's needs because they're not durable enough, or we exceed our allotment and this is what we have to pay out of pocket. So just going through that process first and making sure you have all those documents before you submit your application is just really, really helpful in getting it processed and making sure it's complete when it's submitted. So an example of this would be like the CDPAP. I had somebody who was requesting respite, but they were receiving CDPAP. So in order to process an application like that, we would require a printout of the time card to show the address where the service is being received, what hours and times, and a very specific justification about the individual's disability, about why the additional need is required, and how it relates to the disability. Whichever program you're enrolled in, just keep in mind that we're going to need those supporting documents to explain why there is an additional need. Sorry. There we go. So these services cannot be duplicated. And that's the most important thing to keep in mind, that we are going to have to be checking to make sure that these services are not duplicated. And if the information's already there when the application is submitted, it just makes that process a lot faster so that we can reimburse you for the request. And also keeping in mind that these services have to be used and exhausted before applying to the program, because family reimbursement is a program of last resort. So what are our reimbursable services and goods? These are the main categories that our program covers. We get a lot of uncovered medical expenses, like I was talking about earlier, supplements, dietary or nutritional, and just explaining, how you need the item and how it relates to the disability. With uncovered medical expenses, we are required to have a clinical justification for those. So you would have to have the doctor fill out a justification form and submit that with the application. Respite is another very large category that we reimburse for regularly, and that provides the caregiver relief, the demands of caregiving for an individual. And on that justification on the application, you should really be describing how the individual, those behaviors, the severity of the disability, and how it justifies the request. And there are certain guidelines, like I said, within each category. For respite, for instance, we don't cover during sleeping hours. We don't cover before and after school care, and we don't cover during school breaks. Anytime that any person would need to provide care for their child would not be eligible. And then just keeping in mind that there is a age requirement, an age limit. So it's just it's kind of like common sense, so for the age, it's 13. So if you're over 13 years old, then that would justify the need for covering during school breaks or after school or things like that, because any typical 13-year-old would be expected to stay home by themselves. But since they're meeting that age requirement, then we can look at that application a little differently. But until you're 13, then you wouldn't be able to submit for those hours for respite. Adaptive equipment, an example of this is we reimbursed for a pushchair for somebody. They obviously, when you have a request like that, we're obviously going to need a little bit more documentation. So we had to have an OTPT clinical justification. But we were able to help that family out with that, which was great. I mentioned before, we helped with the sled. Adaptive equipment also falls under technology, and so we can do electronic devices such as tablets or laptops. The guidelines for that are 1 every 3 years, and we only cover basic models. And then I would just suggest reviewing those exact guidelines for technology before submitting that application, just to make sure that everything on the application matches the eligibility requirements. We get a lot of requests for therapies. So the horse riding therapy, for instance, if you were going to apply for that, you would just be describing the delays of the individual, describing the benefit. For example, it can help develop interpersonal skills, learning tasks, time management, importance of care, things like that. And then having that clinical justification with that request. Another type of therapy that we typically cover is music therapy. So for instance, there might be an individual with cardiomyopathy or which caused like a traumatic brain injury. So that therapy is helping to improve that functioning of that individual. And it's just really nice to be able to help these families with such, obviously the more severe the disability, then it's just a really great program to just be able to do that for them. So another category is clothing. So an example of this would be we had an individual with dwarfism, and they had to get special alterations for their clothing, and we were able to assist in reimbursement for those items, which was great. Legal fees they can only be related to guardianship and special needs trusts. And when processing those requests, the invoice has to be itemized, and it has to say exactly what the service is. So if you're getting legal fees, you would have to specifically mention the guardianship or the special needs trust fund. If you're doing like clothing for that type of disability, you would have to specifically mention exactly what's being altered. So just the more specifics, the more description, the better, the easier to process. We get a lot of requests for recreation. So for instance, we can cover things like the museum, ski events, Rochester Museum and Science Center, and it's just great because we're kind of supporting these local businesses and at the same time helping families. So it's really almost just a dual kind of partnership and just all around helping the community and individuals. So for instances like this, say if you had like a small child, a lot of times they need more community inclusion. They need more attempts and opportunities to learn appropriate interaction and social skills. So the reason that we're reimbursing and funding for these things is to allow the family that extra time to do that, because they might have other expenses where that limits their financial resources. So to be able to provide that extra support to them is the purpose of the program. For older adults, services like Autism Up offer some like classes, such as for instance, we had an application where someone was receiving services for full life, and that didn't teach any specific skill in the format that would meet the guidelines for teaching. So because they were self-directed and they couldn't get that covered under their budget, they were able to submit to us, and we were able to cover those classes for them. And I think it was, that's $900. So that was a huge, portion of that program that they otherwise wouldn't have the funds for. Non-reimbursable items. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't elaborate too much. Obviously, nothing that would be an implied or obvious responsibility of someone else. We wouldn't cover any of those things. And most of these things are not related to the individual or their disability specifically. So they would not be eligible. So I love this slide because it looks like doors, and these are usually doors that we just don't open, but they are there. They're allowable one-time reimbursements. It's a once in a lifetime request, so we don't get a lot of them. I can tell you I have not processed, I don't even think I've processed one of these. I've come close to processing a few, but it's just, it's difficult to get them processed because we need a lot more information, but we can do it in situations where there's an emergency or an absolute need. So it's good to know that they're there in those cases. I actually did process one related to home maintenance, and the purpose of that was the individual was causing damage to the home with their behaviors related to autism. And the family was incurring a lot of repair fees from the landlord. And because it was related to the disability, And because it was an out-of-pocket expense, we were able to help that family get those repairs covered. And, you know, that obviously really helps them keep a good rapport with their landlord too, so that, because a lot of landlords we know are not going to be very nice about something like that, but it was great that we could help that family out in that way. We do get sometimes control requests, and in those instances, we would have to have a plan to show how this is going to be prevented in the future, if it's for a health and safety reason, and the family would be at risk for homelessness. That would be a good justification to process an application like that. But we would need some documentation for the precautions that would be taken before, during, and after an extermination. Utilities and rent, very, very, very unlikely that we get applications like that. But there can, obviously we're not covering for COVID relief or anything like that. But there are specific guidelines to applying for things like that. It can't be more than 2 months behind. You would have to be at risk for eviction, and there would have to be some justification to show preventative measures so that there wouldn't be a reoccurrence in the future. And then you would have to also show that you tried to get this covered somewhere else first. So there's lots of resources in the community where you would be able to do that, and just providing that documentation with your application is going to be a necessary requirement for these kind of requests. So self-directed individuals. So family reimbursement falls under the Family Support Services umbrella. And in order to apply, if you're self-directed, you have to have FSS, Family Support Services, in your budget already. And we talked about earlier, if it's not in there, about filing an amendment to put it in there. So some people have the maximum amount, which is $1,500 right now, or some people just have $500. So it really just depends on what the fiscal intermediary puts in your budget. But it just has to be reflected. With self-direction, we really need some supporting documentation to show that an attempt was made to process for the item or service already under the budget using your other than personal services or your individual goods and services. So just attaching that correspondence with your application is going to make your application more concrete, and it's going to make it a lot easier to process and a lot faster to process. So including those things is really important. We also would require a monthly expenditure to reflect that funds were exhausted in that on the budget if that was the reason that self-direction would not be covering that item. And then we just need your budget summary, obviously, to get all that basic information, such as your FI, your broker, budget date, all that stuff, so that we can enter that all in and keep records of that. So things that they cover under the budget for other than personal services would be like, depending on the age, like advertising for respite. We've gotten some requests in family reimbursement for things like that. So if it can't be covered in the budget, we are going to have to circle back with your FI and make sure that it can't be covered and why. And we would have to have that documentation in order to process. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the Administrative Directive Memorandum, the ADM. It is effective July 1st, 2022. We have received a very loosely introduced transmittal of this. So it's not final or complete, but the basis is to provide more specifics for processing. There are going to be some changes, but it doesn't change the basis of the program. It's really just intended to make sure that you're providing a lot more documentation, just making sure that the request is warranted, and just giving those specifics. That's what OPWDD wants to see. They want to see that everything is justifiable, that everything is complete, and that what you're requesting is really needed because we are a funding source of last resort. So we just have to make sure that there is no other program that can help you, and that we're processing correctly. They just want to be able to clearly verify the need, the disability, and how they relate, and keeping in mind that they're going to want to see more verification for the funding, the transaction, the processing of the transaction. So just making sure that all of those things are very clear when you're submitting an application, especially after these new guidelines go into effect in July. So I just don't want to see applications get put on hold or be delayed because people are kind of surprised that they're getting asked to submit more things. So we're kind of trying to get in the habit of requesting those now and letting people know that once this does go into effect, this additional documentation is going to be required. So just getting into that process now. They're also going to be requesting life plans with the application, which is something new. So just a way for us to take a little bit of a deeper look at exactly what we're processing and making sure that that request is appropriate. So they're not changing the program, they're just kind of tightening up and fine-tuning the process, which is already in place. And they're going to be concentrating on ensuring that applications are complete. So they're going to be strictly enforcing a lot of the guidelines that are already there, such as the 90 days after purchase of goods or services. So if your receipt is more than 90 days old, we're not going to be able to process that because that's outside of the guidelines. Obviously, there's extraordinary circumstances or situations where we could consider it, but typically we're not going to be able to do those kind of things. They really want to see coordinators sticking with the guidelines, and that's why they're kind of going to be including some more specific language to make sure that that happens. So, I mean, it is going to be a little bit more work to gather the information before you submit your request. But, just having that information, having it obtainable and ready is just going to make that easier. So, if you're going to the doctors or you're going to the OT or the PT and something's recommended to you, I would immediately request prior authorization from the doctor or submit that to insurance so that you can start that paperwork process of getting that denial letter, and saving it and submitting it with your application. So just keeping good documentation of everything, that providers are suggesting to you would be a really good idea. And just anticipating that you're going to have to justify your request. I did receive some feedback from families that they get questioned by doctors or providers as to why they want this additional documentation and things like that. And my suggestion to them is always just a general statement. My child or this individual is eligible has eligibility, which allows for additional services and funding from OPWDD based off their that eligibility, and that's why you require that documentation so that you can submit that request. So if families have that question and they, they feel like they're having a hard time getting a justification or anything like that, I would just reinforce that message to the provider, that they have this eligibility status, which allows them to get additional services and funding. You really don't have to go into too much more detail than that. So my advice for completing an application would be to just review the guidelines, understand what is allowable, what is eligible, and how. And I always encourage people that they can just reach out if they're, if there's an extraordinary circumstances where they're not sure, or even in instances where our job, that's our job, is to inquire about what's eligible and what's not, especially in those extraordinary situations, so that we can generate ideas about what additional supporting documents we can get, and really just try and process your request. And I never like to tell anybody no immediately. I'll always look into it first. So that would just be my best advice on, if you have a question, please reach out. That's what we're here for. So I just wanted to point out in this slide, we've been supporting people in Monroe County for over 65 years through our programs. So the Arc of Monroe has an enormous knowledge base with dedicated staff that has long-standing employment. So, I mean, I tell people, just anything you have a question about, just call me, just ask me. I'm more than happy, if I don't know the answer, to find the answer and get that back to you. So I just constantly encourage, please reach out to me. And if I can't help you, I can direct you to the appropriate department. And like I said, we just have such a knowledge base in this organization. And we're just here to help, and that's what we do. So thank you for joining us today. And then real quick, I just want to pull up the application. So this is, can you see this? Sorry, I have to go back here. Can everyone see this checklist or no?
It's still showing the slides.
The slides, okay.
Yep.
Sorry. Oh, here we go.
You're able to send it to me, Ann, and I can try to add it.
Let's see. It went away from my clipboard for some reason.
I was going to say, we could see your folder right now.
Okay. So I always send these out Can you wait?
No.
Nope. I got it.
I was going to say, if you can't,
Here's
there we go.
Here's our clinical justification form. So basically just, describing the individual's disability, how it relates to the request. This is the form that we created. You wouldn't have to necessarily use this form. A doctor's note would be fine. But we do send these out just because it's easier for the doctor and for you to know what needs to be on that clinical justification. And I'm going to send you the application, Matt, so we can take a look at it.
Okay.
But in the meantime, does anyone have any questions?
There is a question from AZ Wang. They're asking, can you share the PowerPoint for later? I think, well, we are going to have this whole presentation. We've been recording it, and we will be adding it to the ARC's YouTube page. So you should be able to see everything along with the PowerPoint slide that Anne had put up through there. And they were asking, how do they get the form?
Okay. Can I see the questions too? Because I'm not showing them. Oh, I have it here now. Perfect. So I can email everyone the forms, everyone in that joined today. I'd be happy to do that when we finish. So let's see. What other questions? That's all I see. Is there anything else? Do you accept a phone call with Medicaid as a denial?
You're muted.
I'm muted?
No, you're not muted.
Oh, so I see a question, do you accept a phone call with Medicaid as a denial? The answer would be no. We would prefer something in writing. So like I said, the best way to avoid that situation would be if you know you are going to have a request and there's something that you're going to want to submit for, I would say submit that immediately. As soon as, any provider recommends something, I would say submit it immediately so that you can get something back from them saying that they're not going to cover it. Can water park be considered recreation reimbursement? I would say yes. You just have to make sure when you're completing the application that you are describing the disability, you're describing how the individual is going to benefit from that outing, really describing their behaviors on the application and with that type of request. So someone else says, lately I've been emailing Medicaid and they tell me to call customer service. So I would say, what are you emailing them regarding? and what happens when you call customer service for denials. I know Medicaid is really difficult to deal with. I would just say, you know, try your best to get that denial from Medicaid. If you can't, you know, submit your application with a clinical justification for the need. But I would just really encourage you to try and get that communication in writing. It's just going to be really, really essential, especially as the OPWDD comes out with the new ADM. They're just not going to want to see people submitting without that that denial. Another question was, if something is delayed, will they notify the care coordinator? Will they tell them to obtain more information? Absolutely. Constantly, I am corresponding with care coordinators, and I include the families on the email also. And if I don't hear back from the care coordinator within a certain amount of time, say like a week or 2 weeks at the most, I'll reach out to the directly to the family via phone to find out if they have the additional information that I need and how can I get it so that I can process their application. If we need to see a specialist outside of New York, can treatment fee be reimbursed? The answer to that is no. The only programs or services that we can approve have to be within New York State. The program, they used to allow for out-of-state travel and things like that, but with the new ADM, they're not going to allow for those things anymore. Another question, what is the minimum age that an individual can receive diapers and pull-ups? That's age 3. I just have a travel question mark.
Daisy, can you type in your question? It just says travel. Could you elaborate?
Yes, no longer are we going to be covering travel outside of New York, just with the new ADM. So kind of what I was saying earlier, keeping with the state, keeping with supporting our local providers and our local industries. And also, you know, sometimes if you're going out of state, we can't verify those services. We can't verify really anything. So that's why they're discontinuing that practice. So this is our application. So what's really important on here is that every single thing needs to be filled out. Sometimes, you know, I get applications and they don't have a name on them, or care coordinator contact information. So in order to be able to process that, I really need a complete application. Number 5, a lot of people miss that. It's what are you requesting, and right here, total amount requested on this application. So it just goes right here. A lot of people miss that, but it really is a required portion of the application that needs to be completed. This is our most current form. So any other forms that you have are not going to be able to be processed because they're outdated. This is what I was talking about here, the justification box, number 9. Really need to describe the behaviors very, very specifically. We don't know the individual, and I know that sometimes it can probably be, you know, second nature to you because you spend so much time with them. But just really, we really need to see very specific information as to what the disability is, how it's relating to the request. We can't have general information in that box. It needs to really have a really good description there of how it relates. Right here, you see 03/2022. That is the indication that that is the most current application. And anything that doesn't say that is an outdated application that we can't accept. We need the original signature, and we need the date. You can submit this yourself. Your care coordinator can submit it, but it just really has to be complete. So Laura has a question. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining. I know I talk to her frequently. She says, MAS Medical Answering Services provides for seeing a doctor for out-of-state travel. Can you send new family reimbursement application to CCO? I can send the new family reimbursement application. I'm not sure about that question, medical answering services. We can't process anything from like a medical answering service or just anything that's not within the state.
Laura, are you saying it maybe is that the answer to when AZ was saying could a reimbursement pay for a doctor outside of New York? Are you just saying that medical answering service is an option?
Gotcha.
That's how I read it. I just want to make sure that that's what Laura, what you mean.
It's an option for them to get reimbursed for travel to see a doctor out of state.
Thank you very much.
For respite, are we adding more than provide relief to caregivers? Yes, for respite, you're adding more than provide relief to caregivers. You're describing their disability, you're describing their behaviors, you're describing exactly what it's like, just this, how the disability affects and applies to the need for respite. So yes, please elaborate on those justifications. That's really going to be really essential and necessary going forward. It's really an incomplete application if it's not spelled out. And I think that's the thing with the new ADM. They're just trying to spell things out more. So that's just really the purpose.
I know we're getting close to our allotted time. Does anybody else have any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Anne for her very thorough and complete presentation. You gave a lot of great information, Anne, so we thank you for giving us your time and information. And I know that if people do have any questions, like Anne said, feel free to reach out to Anne. You can email myself as the outreach coordinator. I can also discuss any other programs or services and talk about next steps for anything as well. So we appreciate your time. But yeah, feel free to email me. Again, don't forget if you do want the coupon for the free cookie, don't forget to email so I can and provide your address so I can send that out to you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thanks for setting this up. And I did include my contact information and all the contact information for everybody in Family Support Services on that agenda that went out. So you should have that. And then, like I said, I will email everybody that joined today all the information on family reimbursement. And I look forward to continuing to process applications for you. I love the program. I want to keep it going. And the best way to keep it going is to complete applications according to the guidelines and according to the OPWDD requirements. And we don't want to see this program go away. And the best way to do that is to just keep within the guidelines and make sure that we're submitting everything with as much completeness as possible. And it's going to be really important going forward with the new ADM that happens. So thank you so much. I look forward to talking with everyone soon.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.